In the early hours of July 10, 1941, as Guderian's armored spearheads closed to within just 300 kilometers of Moscow, something extraordinary was happening inside the Kremlin. Stalin made a decision that even his closest advisors couldn't comprehend. He ordered the evacuation of the Soviet Union's entire industrial heartland. This wasn't a strategic withdrawal or temporary relocation. This was a plan to rip millions of tons of factory equipment and over 10 million workers from under the Germans' noses and haul them thousands of kilometers away to the Siberian wilderness. Everyone thought it was the scheme of a madman, but this insane decision would ultimately save the Soviet Union and change the fate of the entire world. The German blitzkrieg was unlike anything the world had ever seen. In just 3 weeks, Hitler's steel avalanche had shredded the carefully constructed Soviet defense lines in the west. Minsk fell, Bialystok was encircled, and hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops were annihilated in massive cauldrons of destruction. What made it even more terrifying was that German advances were completely outpacing all predictions, objectives that were supposed to take months to reach. The Wehrmacht was approaching in mere weeks. Smolensk was under threat. Leningrad was in danger. Kiev was crying for help. The entire Western Soviet defense line was collapsing like dominoes. But what kept Stalin awake at night wasn't the loss of territory. It was the threat to his industrial base. 80% of Soviet military production was concentrated in the western regions. The tank factories of Kharkov, the shipyards of Leningrad, the steel mills of Donetsk. These industrial giants produced 90% of Soviet tanks, 75% of aircraft, and virtually all heavy artillery. If these factories fell into German hands, not only would the Soviets lose their ability to produce weapons, but Germany would gain access to the world's most advanced military technology. Even more devastating, Soviet skilled workers and engineers would be forced to serve the German war machine. This meant the scales of war would tip completely, and the Soviet Union would face total defeat within months. Facing this nightmare scenario, Stalin knew he had to make the most difficult decision of his life. On the night of June 24th, just 3 days after the German invasion began, an ultra-secret committee was formed in the Kremlin. Only 5 people knew about it: Stalin, Molotov, Beria, Mikoyan, and Voznesensky. They weren't discussing how to resist the Germans, but how to completely evacuate the Soviet Union's entire industrial foundation. Before the Germans arrived, the operation was codenamed Thunderstorm, and its scale and complexity exceeded any industrial transfer in human history. They planned to completely dismantle and relocate 1,523 major factories in the shortest possible time, involving over 2 million pieces of equipment and more than 10 million people. This was equivalent to relocating Germany's entire industrial base within a few months. During the first week of July, while German forces were still celebrating their victories at Smolensk, evacuation orders had already been secretly dispatched to factories across the Soviet Union. Factory directors receiving these orders could hardly believe their eyes. The evacuation wasn't for select equipment or important machinery. It was for every single component of entire factories, including wiring, screws, and even the beds in worker dormitories. Even more shocking was the timeline. Most factories had to begin dismantling within 72 hours and complete loading within a week. This requirement would have been nearly impossible to meet during peacetime, let alone during wartime. But orders were orders, and refusing to comply meant treason. The process of dismantling factories was more complex than anyone had imagined. Soviet engineers not only had to remove every machine, but also meticulously document the position, function, an assembly sequence of every component. They drew tens of thousands of detailed blueprints, marking the exact location of every pipe, every circuit, every connection. The purpose was singular: to ensure these factories could be perfectly reconstructed at their new locations. A large, rolling mill was broken down into over 3,000 parts, each piece numbered, packaged, and recorded. Even factory bricks and cement were tagged so they could restore the original structural integrity. During reconstruction, this level of precision seemed absolutely insane at the time. But this madness would ultimately save the Soviet Union. What's almost impossible to believe is that German intelligence had absolutely no clue about this massive evacuation operation. Thousands of trains loaded with dismantled factory equipment were racing eastward day and night. Yet German reconnaissance aircraft and spy networks were completely oblivious to this epic industrial migration. German intelligence was entirely focused on frontline military operations, monitoring Red Army movements, weapons quantities, and defensive fortifications, while completely overlooking the industrial evacuation that would truly determine the war's outcome. The German mindset was typically military. They believed that capturing factories meant acquiring industrial capacity, never imagining that the Soviets would pack up entire factories and move them. This blind spot became one of Germany's most fatal errors. The transportation process was an unprecedented challenge. The Soviet railway system was handling loads several times beyond its design capacity. Over 500 trains loaded with dismantled factory equipment were racing eastward daily, with a total weight exceeding 3 times the Soviet railway system's normal daily capacity. Railway workers labored around the clock, many going days without sleep. Train engineers drove overloaded trains through war-torn territory without detailed schedules. Many transport routes were under threat from German bombers, but the evacuation trains never stopped. Every minute of delay could mean the destruction of a factory, and every successful transport was buying time for the Soviet Union's future. Accompanying the equipment evacuation was one of the largest population migrations in human history. Over 10 million workers, engineers, and their families followed these factories on the journey east. This group included the Soviet Union's finest technical experts, most experienced industrial workers, and most knowledgeable production managers. They carried simple luggage, said goodbye to ancestral homes, and boarded trains bound for unknown destinations. Many didn't know where they were going, only that they had to follow the factories. Train cars were overcrowded, food was scarce, sanitary conditions were terrible. But nobody complained. They knew this was for their homeland's survival, for ultimate victory. This spirit of collective sacrifice was rare in human history. When these factories reached their destinations, they were often greeted by nothing but wilderness. Many factories' new locations were in remote areas of Siberia, with no existing factory buildings, worker housing, or even basic infrastructure. Workers had to build temporary shelters with their bare hands in -40-degree temperatures, then begin reconstructing the factories. They dug foundations in frozen ground with primitive tools, built temporary factory halls with wood and canvas, and worked by kerosene lamp light without electricity. Many lost their lives in this process, dying from extreme cold, disease, or exhaustion. But their sacrifice enabled the rebirth of Soviet industry and laid the foundation for ultimate victory. Under these extremely harsh conditions, Soviet workers created truly incredible miracles. They operated precision machinery in factory halls, without roofs, assembled complex equipment in snow-covered fields, and performed metal welding in -30-degree temperatures. Many technical problems actually achieved breakthrough solutions under these extreme conditions. Material shortages forced engineers to find alternatives. Harsh environments required them to improve production processes, and time pressure pushed them to simplify complex procedures. Some production techniques invented in Siberia later proved more advanced and efficient than the originals. War pressure and extreme environments actually sparked an explosion of technological innovation. The speed of reconstruction amazed everyone. Many factories resumed production within weeks of arriving at their new locations, with some even beginning partial production during transport. Workers assembled small components inside train cars, repaired equipment in hastily erected tents, and conducted quality testing in open-air conditions. They knew that frontline soldiers were using flesh and blood to resist German steel, waiting for every shell, every tank they produced. The sense of urgency unleashed superhuman energy and efficiency. By the end of 1941, most evacuated factories had resumed production, with total capacity even exceeding pre-war levels. The Germans didn't realize what had happened until months later, when Guderian's tanks rolled into Soviet industrial cities. They found only empty factory halls and deliberately left obsolete equipment. All advanced machinery, technical blueprints, and skilled workers had vanished without a trace. German engineers inspecting these empty facilities could hardly believe their eyes. The Soviets had even removed the wiring and dug up the foundations. Hitler flew into a rage when he learned this news, ranting in his headquarters for an entire night. He couldn't understand how the Soviets had completed such a massive operation right under his nose, and couldn't accept that his carefully planned blitzkrieg had come up empty. By spring 1942, the evacuated factories began demonstrating astonishing production capacity. These factories rebuilt in Siberia not only restored their original capacity, but exploded with even greater productivity under wartime stimulus. T-30 for tank production increased 300% over pre-war levels. Artillery production increased 400%, and ammunition production soared 600%. These numbers left German intelligence completely baffled. They had occupied 80% of Soviet industrial regions and destroyed countless factories. Yet Soviet military production hadn't decreased, but dramatically increased. German commanders began questioning their intelligence sources, with some even suspecting the Soviets had received alien assistance. Only after the war ended did they fully understand the truth about this industrial evacuation. Weapons produced by these evacuated factories quickly played a decisive role on the battlefield. In the 1942 Battle of Stalingrad, 70% of Soviet tanks came from these rebuilt factories. In the 1943 Battle of Kursk, Soviet artillery superiority came entirely from Siberian military bases. In the 1944 Operation Bagration, Soviet powerful mechanized forces were almost entirely equipped with weapons from these factories. Every T-30 for tank rolling toward Berlin, every roaring Katyusha rocket launcher, every Ilta Sturmovik soaring over Europe carried the sweat and sacrifice of Siberian workers. Witnessing the success of this unprecedented industrial evacuation, Stalin's determination for this plan was absolute, never wavering despite enormous doubt and pressure. When some generals suggested using evacuation transport capacity for troop movements, Stalin flatly refused. When some Politburo members worried that evacuation would affect frontline resistance, Stalin stood firm. He understood a simple but brutal truth. Without an industrial base, any number of troops were just expendable. Without weapons production capability, even the most heroic warriors couldn't sustain combat. This decision required enormous political courage and historical vision, because in the short term, evacuation did weaken Soviet resistance, But history proved this was one of the most brilliant strategic decisions of World War II. The international community's reaction to Soviet industrial evacuation evolved from ignorance to shock. British and American intelligence initially knew nothing about Soviet evacuation plans, assuming, like the Germans, that Soviet industrial capacity would disappear with territorial losses. When the Allies discovered in 1942 that the Soviet Union hadn't been crushed but was demonstrating even stronger military production capacity, they realized something incredible had happened. American military experts concluded, after studying Soviet industrial data, that this was the greatest feat in human industrial history. No country could complete such massive industrial transfer in such a short time. This discovery made Western allies reassess Soviet war potential and the possibility of ultimate victory. This industrial evacuation had a fatal impact on German strategy. Germany's entire operational plan was built on quickly occupying Soviet industrial regions, counting on using Soviet industrial capacity to support the long Eastern Front war. When they discovered these factories were empty shells, the Germans had to rely entirely on domestic industrial production to sustain the massive Eastern Front consumption. But German industrial capacity simply couldn't support multiple front demands simultaneously, especially after the Allies began bombing German domestic industry. Conversely, Soviet industrial capacity began comprehensively surpassing Germany after 1942, and this production advantage ultimately became the decisive factor in determining war outcomes. Hitler later admitted that underestimating Soviet industrial transfer capability was one of his most serious strategic errors. After the war, this industrial evacuation unexpectedly accelerated Soviet modernization. Many previously backward Siberian regions rapidly developed into modern industrial centers. Due to factory relocations, cities like Novosibirsk, Omsk, Chelyabinsk, and Magnitogorsk became important Soviet industrial bases after the war. Technical improvements and process optimizations forced during evacuation significantly upgraded Soviet industrial standards. Some production techniques invented under extreme conditions were later widely applied, becoming important foundations for post-war Soviet industrial development. In a sense, this forced evacuation accelerated Soviet industrial modernization and laid groundwork for post-war economic construction. Looking back at this history, we must acknowledge this as the greatest example of creativity and execution humanity has shown when facing desperate circumstances. Within just a few months, the Soviet Union successfully transferred its entire national industrial foundation, preserving the fundamentals of war victory. This plan's success not only changed World War I's outcome, but proved what amazing energy a nation could unleash at critical survival moments. It tells us that true strength lies not in what you possess, but in what you're willing to sacrifice. True wisdom lies not in what you defend, but in what you dare to change. In May 1945, when Soviet T-34 tanks charged through Berlin's streets, many came from those factories reborn in Siberian wilderness. These steel giants carried the sweat and sacrifice of millions of workers, witnessing humanity's most insane, yet most successful industrial escape. As Hitler took his life in his bunker, he perhaps finally understood one truth. What truly determines war outcomes was never the balance of power at war's start, but adaptation and transformation capabilities during war. The Soviet industrial evacuation proved this truth in the most extreme way, providing humanity's most valuable historical experience for facing crises. This evacuation ultimately saved the Soviet Union, changed the world, and left the most magnificent chapter in human civilization's history.